today, I have Dave Brown with us. Dave is with Amazon Web Services, and he's the head of design, AI services, and generative AI. Dave, welcome to the stratosphere.
Good morning.
Yes, welcome. And I want to talk with you about your work at Amazon, the collaboration framework that we had posted about. But first, um, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the position you're in right now?
Sure. I've been in various product and design roles for the last about 20 years. First at smaller agencies, production companies, kind of doing everything from consumer, e-com, and then joined AWS about 6 years ago and have been leading the AI and ML team for the last five. And over those 5 years, we've really seen a lot of growth in the number of services that we've launched. I've launched 13 new services, and there's kind of been this transition from traditional machine learning, and we'll talk about this today, to where we are today with Gen AI and really developing for all sorts of different types of customers, from developers to knowledge workers to data scientists. So it's been a really fun journey.
Well, Dave, to be honest, I'm honored that you're here today. This is a real privilege to be able to have this hour with you. So thank you for taking time out for this. Let me mention also that Dave is going to be an instructor at the AI Product Design Bootcamp. It's going to be May 13th to 15th. We have moved it online, so it's accessible now to everyone. Um, Dave, working at Amazon is rarefied air, and I've been out of the UX business for a while. So at in the year 2000, I was at Sapient, and we had Terrell of content strategy, me, information architect, um, various PMs, front end developers, and then we would work for a few months and then toss over the concept and the product to the development team. And then they would freak out and then do something after that. I wasn't really sure what they did because I went on to something else. That was the year 2000. I did have a wonderful flight to Rio de Janeiro, first class. Woke up in the morning, kind of drooling, realizing I was sitting next to the CEO of the company that I was flying to go help. Um, so kind of crazy days back then. I started my own company in 2002, and then um, Agile Manifesto came and did away with the nonsense that I did in 2000. But then it was more this backlog. You work on a backlog, the PM puts stuff up there. You had to say how long it was going to take you. But then I lost track. So tell me about collaboration in the product design world in 2020 or 2019, before 2020,
Mm.
because I want to ask you about today, but I want to see the progression from where back in my day to today, but I'm missing the 2020. I know Figma became really important and there was a different kind of process. So would you mind talking about collaboration first in 2020 or 2019, better times, and then we can move on to today and the framework that you came to discuss.
Sure. And we could talk about there's been a number of new tools, a number of new processes that design has developed and but really I think what matters is rooting in is what is design as a function doing to help support the business, right? Design supports the business to achieve a customer outcome. And so I think across all sorts of different industries, there's been iteration on what are the right tools to use. What is that quote unquote handoff process? Where does the role of a designer start and end? And how do we work with research and front end engineers and all that? And that has been um, that's been a theme over, the last 15, 20 years. How do we do that? Um, and I think what really matters is rooting it in, what is the value for the end customer? Um, who is that customer you're developing for? What is their problems or opportunities? How do we know what they need or want? What's the most important benefit? And what is that customer experience? And I think the more there's going to be different cultures that prioritize different ways of innovating and working. At Amazon, we really take this kind of customer-centric approach, which is really helpful for design because it roots everyone around what's that end experience you want to build. And then you sort of work backwards into, okay, because of that, Here's how we proceed. Um, and so I think like high level, what you want is you want a more tightly integrated uh, set of builders, whatever function that takes within an organization. Some functions may have data scientists, or they may have different types of designers where the titles are different across the function across the companies. But fundamentally, you want a set of builders who are collaborating and working together, and they're all rooted in an understanding of what is that end customer experience that we want built.
What I'm thinking about are people that are on the call, they're in a certain setting right now, things are happening a certain way. In a sense, you're coming back from the future because Amazon, the platform companies, are already sort of operating in the future that most of us are yet to get to and to approach. And I think people are doing, at least I get the impression from LinkedIn that people are doing things in kind of a consistent way today. And yet there's some new skills to learn for tomorrow. And so as we begin to collaborate, I think there's some upskilling that's going to be necessary for the people in the design field, user experience, product design, design research, where they need to know, what do I go study? How do I go figure out the next steps? Because my company's not giving me these native AI products to work on yet. They're just saying, "Hey, go put Gen AI in everything. Just do it. Just paint everything Gen AI." But there's obviously some skills. There's some upskilling that's going to happen. And so I'm just wondering, from your experience, what are some of those skills that you've developed to be a good partner with data science, to be a good partner with
Yeah.
engineering? What have you come across as in your journey?
I I think there's a lot, and I also think we're pretty early in this journey of how do designers work, and what are the best practices for AI UX, right? So there's a lot here, and we'll dive into it over the next hour, and then also during the boot camp that we're doing in May. Um, but I think it's really I might start with, what's changed, right? What's different about developing a product, or what's different about developing um, an experience where you're using AI to power part of that, and how does that contrast with what we've built before, right? And how we've operated for the last, 15, 20, arguably, 50 years, when we go back to the development of GUIs, and how that's changed. So I might start the conversation there, and then we could kind of get into the consequence of that is there's new tools to use, there's new ways of collaborating with each other, there's new artifacts that we're going to produce. And there's probably other things that we've done historically that may not be as valuable or useful to the business anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
As we begin that journey, I kind of see that two different ways. One is top down, like these are the big pieces, these are the chunks. And I see kind of bottom up too, like Dave walking into the office and he's got stuff to do. What's coming up on the computer? What are the bottom up steps? So I'm gonna turn it over to you and just tell us, from your perspective, what are some of the main things that we're looking out for right now?
Yeah. Well, specifically for AI UX, I might sort of contrast where we've been with what I see and where we're going. I think
Perfect.
for the last few decades, right, we've lived in this world where there's these rules-based software. It's very deterministic. And in that world, designers and researchers, they could really understand and control for all the different states that an end user may encounter, right? And we built up a whole set of tactics and tools to help do that more efficiently and more effectively within an organization. And ultimately, like we had a lot of control. Designers could define and work through all those end states. We could define the golden path and what those error states were. Researchers could run studies to learn how users responded to those different states. We could we could measure in testing environments and release features to small cohorts of customers to get confidence, and then roll that out across all of our customers. We created these design systems and design patterns to have consistency, and so all this sort of predicated on driving scale and consistency. And now with AI, we're moving into less determinism and more probabilism, right? So we've got sort of the probabilistic nature of AI means that that application's runtime experience can significantly diverge from what we tested in build, right? Like what we measured and tested in staging can be a different experience for the end customer. And so there are changes to the way that designers and PMs and engineers and scientists and everyone needs to work, because we're shifting to sort of, instead of designing for a single golden path with a few edge cases, every experience can be an edge case. Every experience can be highly personalized, can be highly adaptive to an individual user and their context and their background. Um, and so because of that, I th just think that the tooling changes, the tactics change, and even the speed at which designers can operate are changing, and even the boundary conditions of what is the role of a designer is changing, right? And I think there's a lot of consternation in the field today around designers are losing the ability to do XYZ, or maybe AI is quote unquote like replacing that specific task. But the flip side of that is, the uh, AI is coming for everyone's tasks, right? And so if you can, the opportunity on the flip side is that designers are now the ability to work across disciplines and create and have ownership over certain areas of that product experience that maybe historically we haven't been able to. So that's a little bit of the backdrop around how I think about, we're moving from kind of deterministic experiences to probabilistic experiences.
Yeah, it seems like the heritage of design is to make a thing, and that thing can be a car, it could be, a cup, it could be a house, it could be a number of different things. But now the AI is kind of designing itself at the actual experience level, and we're more understanding the levers that we have.
I think for designers who think of their role as delivering a set of artifacts as a means towards an end experience, they're going to have a hard time, right? If you find value as a designer in producing a persona or a customer journey map or a specific prototype, um, and that can be done at much lower cost and more efficiently. And the sort of the floor is raised for everyone, and so it becomes more accessible for everyone to do those artifacts, or maybe even those artifacts don't matter as much in this world. Then I think that's going to be it's really shocking, and it's tough. Um, but if you have always rooted the value that you bring as a designer into what is that end experience that you're going to create, right? And that like the final design is what's implemented in code and what the end experience, um, or what the end user experiences, right? Then it's a little bit of a flip, and you can see this new world as like, wow, I'm a lot closer to that customer. The time that it takes for me to develop a prototype or run a usability study at much greater scale, the cost of that is so much lower now, right? And so I think that's a really empowering way of looking at this future, right? It's almost becoming business irresponsible not to make. I think a lot of companies and a lot of tactics, many different companies focus on how do we reduce the risk, right? Like the cost of engineering is so high that before we want to spend 6 weeks to develop the feature, we should do all these set of tactics across design and research to help get greater confidence so that we don't waste time building that feature over 6 weeks. But now if that cost of building that feature isn't 6 weeks, it's one day, right? Then the whole economic incentive of what the value of the designer does and the specific tasks and deliverables that we produce, they're inverted, right? And so I just think you have to understand that if you root the value of what you produce as a designer, mapping back to the business, and design supports the business to achieve a customer outcome, right? It it may change, and we might let go of some of those, the value of some of those previous tactics, but it also opens us up to do a whole new set of things that historically we may not have been prohibitive to do because of cost or skill level or whatever.
Well, let me take this opportunity to say that Dave is speaking as Dave. He's not speaking as Amazon today,
Absolutely.
and not going to cover intellectual property that Amazon uses internally. But Dave, what does that choreography look like on a day-to-day basis? Because it seems to me from what you're saying is that that whole team is designing. It's not me, the designer, who's designing. We are designing that thing together. But not being a AI product designer myself, I'm just wondering, in your world, what does that choreography of roles look like?
Yeah. And it's going to look different across different organizations and even whom you're building for looks a little bit different. And so I would say there's products or services that I've worked on or our team has worked on where we're supporting the needs of a specific data scientist, right? And they are the end user. And so um, the collaboration and the way that we work is a little bit different than the abstraction layer if you're building for a kind of traditional quote unquote developer, right? Someone who may not have AI experience, or an end user who's a knowledge worker inside a large enterprise, for example. And so um, that's obviously a little bit of the caveats. Um, but one like high level theme that I think is different about building for with AI or building for AI, I should say, is the importance of working with the science team, right? It could be applied science, research science, data science. Um, I grew up being told that we've got this three-legged stool across product and design and engineering, right? And again, if you've got these deterministic, specific flows and states, and you can define all those things, then that group makes sense. But if you're working in probabilistic outcomes, the science team really is that fourth pillar, right? And so I'll talk about the four-legged stool, sorry, the four-legged chair as opposed to the three-legged stool. Um, and so the way that we work with scientists, um, again, can vary, but it often means they're at the very beginning of that process. Often we're doing um, kind of novel work. Um, and I've had services where we're very often working closely with the science teams. Um, and things are just a little bit different. And this is kind of what we'll get into on this collaboration framework when you're working with this fourth group, right? Because if you think of all the permutations of communication across four groups instead of three, you think of different stages of that product life cycle, and then you blend in, hey, we may think that a model is going to perform a certain way, right? And then we go and we're releasing beta versions or preview versions and we're seeing how in the wild it's a little bit different. We're going to have to adjust. And so I just think it broadly speaking, it's a lot more iterative. It's a lot more collaborative. Um, and you need more cycles as a team to get to, I think, a great experience and a great truth.
Excellent. Well, I imagine that as you hire people to do those things, that there are certain aspects of their professional life that you're looking for. What kinds of people do well in the environment that you're talking about, and what kinds of people struggle?
Yeah. Um, Well, specifically within AWS, like having a technical aptitude and a curiosity for understanding the underpinnings of that AI stack is really core and really critical. And I tend to believe that this is going to become an important piece of every designer for every builder. There's a whole new technical stack that's emerging. Certainly models and model inference is a core piece of that. And there's new models coming out every day. But but there's also this whole other tooling layer that's combined with the model, right? And so you get into things like building a RAG system and building agents. How do you provide guardrails for responsible AI? You have prompt management systems. You have ways that you're evaluating something pre-production and how you're observing those end results live. And so there's, it's kind of the iceberg underneath the experience. There's a new technical stack that's emerging and changing really rapidly. Um, and if you think like we've gone through this before, and it's important for designers to understand that technical stack because it changes the way that you're going to build that experience, right? Like we would all agree that if you're having the way a designer would approach the UI, if there's a client side error versus a server side error, it's going to be different, right? And just over the years, we've developed those best practices, and there's common patterns and there's common mental models on how we work around that. Um, and that's going to happen with AI UX as well. It's really early right now, but that as a community is I think the journey that we're on of developing those best practices. And so for designers to really shape that and own it and be that translation layer between the end customer experience and that underlying technical stack, we've got to learn these things, right? We've got to understand the technical. So I think one, that's the first piece is like under a curiosity and a desire to learn that technical stack and engage. Um, Two, um, people who are really comfortable with ambiguity. Right? They view ambiguity as this fun puzzle to solve. It's a Rubik's cube, and we're going to iterate, and we're gonna go through a lot of cycles, and a lot of those aren't going to work, and we're going to bang a head against our wall. But we'll figure it out. And if you can be um, comfortable in that state of ambiguity with still a certain sense of urgency, I think designers are going to be really successful with AI UX. If you come from a place of a lot of rigidity, where I've always done it this way, or we've always approached, this specific set of tactics or processes in the same way, um, I think people will struggle, and it's also just not as much fun to build, right? So, people that are really curious and comfortable with ambiguity. Um, and then, um, so those are kind of two main things that I always look for. I know rule of three, I should have three things, but those are kind of like the two main things that I always look for. And then we could kind of, there's certainly a handful more, but maybe I'll stop there.
Let me ask you this. Something that people mention to me a lot is the ability of designers to imagine something in the future that doesn't exist and bringing that to the table. Now, I imagine in Amazon Web Services that the business stakeholders have defined pretty well the problem that you're looking at. But what about the contribution of designers to ideate and imagine things that right now there's not an analog for? Because in AI product design, imagine the experiences we're going to be able to design for are a whole lot of new experiences. How does
Yeah.
that creativity come into play?
Yeah. Well, again, I think it depends on the company and whom you're building for sure. Um, I tend to think of it as at different layers of the stack, of the technical stack. Who are you building for? Um, and so, at that very top layer is that presentation layer, right? It could be a chat experience, it could be a voice-enabled experience, it could be kind of sprinkling AI features onto an existing product or service like we've seen a lot. Um, or or often in AWS, we're building a set of tools to help developers build their own experiences, right? And so we may be that connected layer, sort of doing the undifferentiated heavy lifting of helping a developer get access to the right model, configure it in a way that's useful for their use case, connecting to different, vector databases to help build a knowledge base or a RAG solution, building an agent, testing it. And so there's different levels of abstraction that I certainly work at in my role. And I know, everyone's looking at. So I think the first piece is sort of underlying, rooting everything back and who is that customer and what abstraction layer are you building for? And then that's going to probably dictate a little bit of the collaboration piece of whom are you working with, right? So if you're building at that lower, generally the lower level infrastructure that you're working with, the more tightly connected with the science team or the applied scientist you may be, right? Because you're actually training a custom model, or you're taking an existing model and customizing it in some way, right? Whether you're doing fine tuning of the actual model or you're connecting to these other tooling layers. At a higher abstraction layer, the sort of extreme of that is like you're just an AI wrapper, right? Like the end customer is just putting a prompt into some chat input, and they're getting the response. You're just presenting that back to the user, right? So there's less control there at the underlying infrastructure layer. But I think even at that point, there's a opportunity for design to work across product and engineering and saying, how do we help bring the right context, to the user in this situation? How do we understand the history and the memory of their previous conversations? How do we think about errors and recoveries when these things break, right? So there's a whole set of opportunities at different layers of the stack. And wherever you are in your company or your career, um, I'd encourage everyone to think about, working at places where you can move up and down that stack because you learn different things.
Excellent. Well, let me mention that we're at half point right now. So 30 minutes in, we're going to go 30 more minutes. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to ask for questions in chat. We'll start looking through chat and see if there are questions there. Please start entering your questions now. Dave, we have about 10 more minutes before I start looking in chat. How would you like to structure your talking about the framework, the collaboration framework for those 10 minutes?
Oh gosh. Um, well, maybe we could start. So we've talked about sort of historical building of products and experiences, kind of these deterministic flows. Maybe we could talk a little bit around demystifying AI, and I might make the distinction between traditional machine learning and then Gen AI, right? And what's different about those, and even within there, there's I think there's nuance worth getting into.
That sounds good, and I'll ask questions that an ignorant person might ask, because again, I don't work in, especially not at the level of Amazon, but even on the AI products. So I'll ask questions that maybe a traditional user experience designer might be wondering.
Yeah. So maybe we could just start with what were things like 3, 4, 5 years ago with
Okay.
traditional machine learning, right?
Yeah,
Uh, I think I'll really try to simplify it here, but we had a lot of experiences where you started with data, and then you built a model, and then that led to a product, right? And so uh, typically a data scientist or an ML engineer would collect data, prepare, clean data, um, and then use that to train a model, right? So you've got data, you've got a model. That model is trained on that data, and so it's often for very narrow or specific tasks, right? You can do regression, classification, transcription, translation. And so that's a lot of the traditional machine learning, or what people now are calling AI, right? That we typically saw over the last, decade. That could be a personalization engine, a recommendation system, right? We've had these for a decade plus on Amazon or on Netflix to recommend the next thing that you're going to build. Um, so that's what we had, right? We had data that leads to a model that leads to a product. Now flip to 2022-ish, right? And we've got Gen AI. Okay. So still called AI. What's different about Gen AI? Um, Gen AI is designed to generate new content, right? It could be text, it could be code, it could be images, and you're doing that to build and there's different models for that. There's broadly speaking, like super high level, right? There's LLMs and there's diffusion models if you're generating images. But in contrast to the first paradigm where you start with data, then you build a model, and then you build a product, now builders, I'll just use the term builders, are able to just to sort of start with the product experience that they want, right? And then based off of that product experience, because they can use an off-the-shelf LLM, like a Claude Sonnet 3.5 from Anthropic or an open source model, right? Or, Meta's Llama models or OpenAI models. You can start and build that product experience, right? And then if it's successful or as it is successful, you can then sort of collect more data based off of real customer usage, um, and augment that experience. And that at the end result, you can create kind of like your own custom model. So it's a little bit of the inversion of what we saw with traditional machine learning. And so rather than focusing on specific discrete tasks, right, where the measurement of that traditional machine learning had a whole set of metrics of F1 score and precision and recall, and you could sort of like test and understand things a little bit more. With Gen AI, a lot of that is very different. And so I just think with Gen AI, you're sort of starting with what's that product experience that you want, right? And then how does that flow into the data that you're going to augment within that experience, or really I think about like providing the model or the AI system with the right context, and then from there, that can lead into other ways that you're going to customize and you sort of get this flywheel going.
Nice. And so, what are some of the steps to prepare for this changeover to what's possible now? Because imagining the end experience to me sounds like a great place to have arrived at. That we're now finally doing experience design rather than which button to click and things like that. But how do you prepare for that changeover in a practical sense? If I'm working in an e-commerce company, not Amazon, but some other vertical, home
Yeah.
improvement.
Well, maybe we'll just abstract it away from whatever, whatever you're building. You're still rooted in, hey, what's that great end customer experience that we want to build, right? But we understand that with AI UX, you have the opportunity of things that are more probabilistic than deterministic. And so I still think you would go through kind of some of those traditional ways of human-centered design, of understanding kind of what are the points of initial discovery, right? What's the ingress into trying this AI powered feature out, right? And maybe it's not just putting a sparkle on it, right? Like maybe there's other ways to integrate that capability into the natural flow of what a customer is doing, right? So you've got discovery, you've got the ingress experience, and then the next piece is that iteration loop. And here's where I think it starts to get really interesting with AI UX. Um, because if a customer can describe in natural language what outcome they want, then the job's pretty easy, right? But but often humans are messy. We don't have the language to describe exactly what we want. We want to go through a lot of iteration. And as you go through that iteration loop, there's, I believe, like a whole new set of opportunity to develop new interaction patterns, new ways of control, to help the human interact with the AI, right? So we've talked about like HCI over the last, decades, human computer interaction. This is sort of human to AI interaction. And so maybe there's new types of discrete controls that you as the designer would propose for this with your counterparts to help provide the right context to the AI. So these could be things like, if you're doing a color picker, right? I think we would all say like, yeah, natural language is probably not the best way to do a color picker. Or if you're trying to do, set the EQ for a mix, of audio with all these different sliders and dials, you probably wouldn't want to do that through natural language. Now, you might use natural language to sort of get to the initial jumping off point and then tweak and control. And so I think there's this whole set of ways of humans interacting with the AI through this iteration loop that you're going to go through. Okay, so we've got discovery and ingress, the initial experience, the iteration loop. There's a lot there, and then you've got the sort of overall outcome that you've got. How do you think about repeat usage? How do you think about what context do we save for future interactions and what do we disregard? Um, and this is where you get into things like agents and how you have memory across multiple chats, right? How do you even organize maybe that chat context across different workflows? How do you think about the atomic element of what is built and what do you retain and what is that feedback loop of how that goes back into the indicator experience? So that fourth piece is sort of the returning user experience. How does that experience get better over time? And this is an area where I think designers and product builders should really spend a lot of time of thinking about how does this experience get better the more customers interact with it, right? Because if you don't have that, I don't know that you have a hook, right? Like your product, um, this is sort of the like you're just a chat GPT wrapper at that point, right? But there's a lot you can do to help provide the right context for a user for that repeat usage. And so that's kind of like the broad customer experience that I think about that's a little bit maybe different. Oh, and I guess the last piece of that that's really important is what happens uh, when you have these probabilistic outcomes and it's not what the customer expects, right? So I think with AI UX, there's this real importance on error recovery, right? And how do you help the customer when something doesn't go as expected, right? How do you nudge them or how do you give them the right information so they can self-recover in the right way? So then you sort of layer on top the piece around working with the data scientists and the engineers, and how do you sort of get everyone, rowing in the same direction towards that kind of understanding of those different pieces.
I'm going to look in Q&A in just a second in chat. So if you have a question for Dave, please put it in chat. Um, Dave, we traditionally designers, user experience, product design, we've generated things like wireframes, static prototypes, layouts, functional specifications, etc. What kinds of artifacts do your team generate as they collaborate with the scientists and engineers, et cetera? Are there any um, deliverables or artifacts that you can name that you're generating that feed that process?
Yeah. Um, we may do any or all of those, depending on the project. Um, I think one that is particularly important is around this error recovery, right? What happens when something goes wrong? And particularly now with AI agents being all the rage, what's different about an agent from, where we were 6 months ago is that agents are taking action, right? So it's not just about returning a response, it's about action. And so in that sense, you are often, um, what does an agent have? The technical architecture, right? Like you've got typically some type of reasoning model, right? And you have tools or function calling, so you can that model can invoke other APIs, right? Or MCP is all the rage right now. But you can invoke, through these different protocols, these other APIs. Um, and then you also have this piece of memory, potentially of multi-agent orchestration across many different agents. But um, the artifact can be really valuable there for error recovery is thinking through, there was a designer on my team last year that was working on a project where we were integrating um, with a number of different actions that can be taken, these sort of third-party actions that exist. And focusing on what happens when the AI fails, right? How do you build this resilient design was um, was a real area of importance, right? And so, she worked with the principal engineer and the scientist, and they analyzed across 50 different APIs, right, that are connecting to these different um, third-party tools or actions, and then really looked at the core API operations, right? So the search or the read, the post, the put, the delete, right? What are the common API actions? And then worked with the science team and sort of abstracted all of those things into a common set of patterns. So we don't need to have 50 plus custom responses at the UI layer, but we can have fewer, right? And so things like that look like, how do you work with the science team so that if the user needs to fill out, X number of form fields to invoke the specific action, how can you pre-fill some of those out based off of the historical context, right? Or how do you develop smart defaults that could predict some of those common values? And so, in that sense, like that's kind of and I would say it's a kind of an artifact that we've thought about historically within UX of like, yeah, you got to think about the edge cases and common errors. But just the complexity of that in an AI world where you're working across 50 different APIs, right? And how do you abstract that down into a common set of a few patterns that can be represented at the UI layer so that the user can recover quickly? Um, it's it's very, rich like systems design, horizontal thinking, and you've got to work really closely with the science team to understand the capabilities of those models.
Got it. Okay, let me look in chat here. Um, all right. So it's a comment from LinkedIn from Dennis. What if a customer could describe in natural language what they want and the AI search provided a sorted output in a simple table based on human preferences? Would that change how internet search works and make websites redundant in the future?
Um, I mean, that's the multi-billion dollar question right now, isn't it? Um, so I think we've got to, with search, it's complex. We've got to separate sort of the business model of search of like what is the future of 100 blue links mean from a business model from sort of the actual design and interaction here. So the way I think about um, search is uh, context, right? So there is the, the model is often working with other pieces of technical architecture to retrieve the right response. Um, Now, it could be that that response is in the initial training set, and so it's in the model, and you're just returning what the model has. But particularly for enterprise use cases, the the answer that needs to be retrieved is often spread out across many, many different data sources, many, many different SaaS applications, many different databases. And so there's a lot of work that needs to go into how do you even find that answer and then and retrieve it and then present it back to the user. Um, and what's your level of right? And so what I think about in those use cases is how what's the role of design to help that end user provide the right context, right? And so like the common patterns that you see today is like maybe you have a suggested prompt, right? Okay, that maybe that works. Maybe there are files outside of the training set that we want the user to sort of nudge the AI system to consider, right? That could be really on the nose example would be uploading a local file, right? Um, or it could be understanding what are the different data sources that exist across that AI system. Okay, there I would say, well, maybe the responsibility of the designer is how do you bubble that up and present that to the end user so they can actually see that, right? Sort of surface, I call it surfacing the why, but it's like surfacing why we returned what we did. And maybe there's controls to allow the user to to filter or to modify. And so like in this question, the implication was that we're returning something, I think based off of a table, they said. Could be. Maybe that's the zero shot first response. Great. The real challenge is like how do you then iterate on that? What are the other ways that you can filter and modify to get those results to that ultimate outcome that you want? And so what's the other context that's available that you can help bring into that experience?
All right. Here's a question from Tara. Hi, Dave. What are your thoughts of the future of inputs for product design? Right now, so much of it's text-based, for example, but what about image inputs, flow diagrams, video inputs, face timing and agent, UX designer?
Yeah.
How do you
Uh,
see that evolving?
yeah, I think it's a great question. You know, if you want the model to return a great output, you need to feed it with the right inputs, right? And today, the inputs that we often design for is the responsibility goes to that end user, right? This is an empty prompt box. You describe in natural language what you want. Um, but I've seen so many exciting experiences or patterns where designers and product builders are thinking of new ways to provide the right input into the model, right? So, like I said, a color picker earlier is kind of an easy example to describe this. Like, what would you want as a user? Do you want it to say like make it red? Oh, I need a little more, up the hue or decrease the saturation, or no, like you'd want visual feedback on that. So I think there's this kind of whole class of exciting ways that we can invent to interact, to input, help the user input the right context into that system. That's one area that's really exciting.
I was talking with somebody at Amazon yesterday, and she's responsible for the camera, the in-room camera for designing homes and stuff like that. And it seems like there are also going to be a lot of smart devices that can feed some of those inputs for us.
Yeah, and I think for a long time, I know we've thought about natural language is the new UI, where you're going to do all these things through voice. Um, but personally, there's going to be use cases for that for sure, right? Based off of your situation, your motivation. If you're driving, you probably want to use voice and not look at a screen. Um, but I also think,
That'd be nice.
there's a lot of time, like that initial experience may happen through natural language, but the the response from what you're getting from that AI system, right, is very often visual in nature and what that response is. Now, it may be that we're not deterministically defining all the UI controls and they were always present 100% of the time. It may be that um, the system is going to present the right UI control at that moment for the right context, right? Um, and I don't really mean generating the UI like on the fly, because that sort of implies that it's very ephemeral. Um, I think it'll be more around like you're pulling from this repository of components, right, and assembling on the fly. Um, and that's a really interesting world to think about designing for, because you're thinking very like systems design around what are those different elements and how are they assembled on the fly.
Well, as I was preparing for the conversation today, I was thinking about your cousins over at Amazon.com. And what I really wanted to do was to take a picture of my tomato plant and say, what can I buy to help this poor plant? But anyway, let me move on. Are there tools or artifacts? This is from, oops, lost it. This is from Scott. It keeps jumping
Oh yeah,
around.
tools or artifacts evolving for how to communicate better with dev and data scientists. Is it diagrams or annotated flows as opposed to creating mockups?
That's the one.
Yeah. Um, Yes, I think, I'm my approach is like I'm pretty flexible on the artifact itself because I think it really depends. What are you doing, right? Like the purpose of some artifact or some framework is to provide this common language, right, across different stakeholders to drive common understanding. And so I think depending on whom you're working with, there you should adapt which artifacts that you're sort of proposing and working with. Um, but one kind of like high level tenet that I think is useful is just that the cost and the effort to create some prototype is just dramatically falling, right? It's becoming like business illiterate to have many meetings and hours to debate something when that can just be built and tested and prototyped. And so I tend to think if you think of like the chain of all the artifacts that designers have traditionally produced, my general advice would be like move closer of indexing on creating artifacts that can get to the truth of being able to get feedback from real customers. Now, that doesn't mean
Yeah,
you do some of those earlier things necessarily. It just means like the level of investment that you may do for that. Like you might do it just for you to help drive clarity for your own thought process to get you to some other deliverable. But like I think historically designers get really caught up on like what is our design process? And other functions are not like this. Um, we often sort of like celebrate all these artifacts in the process, and like we did X, Y, we did one, two, three to get to like ta-da, to get to the final payoff. And like honestly, like a lot of other functions just don't care about that, right? Design supports the business to achieve a customer outcome. So the closer you can get to that customer outcome through whatever artifact that is, just push it farther in that development cycle, I think the better.
yeah. I remember a conversation with a cross-functional team about 20 years ago. I still remember it very clearly when somebody said, "We've been talking about this and we just spent thousands of dollars of the customer's money. Can we make a decision and move on?" So,
Yeah. And often that decision should just be let's build this first thing and then let's iterate from there. Yeah.
well, let me, you can post the, let me keep skipping around. Room has asked, oh, keeps jumping. Considered how we have to design new behaviors for this new technology, where have you been drawing inspirations from when you're innovating?
Gosh. Uh, I find it impossible to not be inspired by all the great building that's going on right now. Um, I think at the sort of product strategy or the product level, what you're seeing is um, there are a lot of existing products or services where you're sort of adding AI features into that, and there's a sort of challenge there that's interesting to see how companies and designers navigate that. And then there's also this whole new class of sort of AI native from the ground up. We're starting with a new set of assumptions around what it means to do XYZ task. And so like I really love following a lot of the startups in that space. And there's lots of great content from different builders. Um, on the design side, some of the things that I'm inspired by are certainly a lot of great builders that I see posting on X or Twitter, and there's a lot of great conversation around just the design side of AI UX there. Um, I love I love Rid's design uh, or Dive Club podcast where he's interviewing different design leaders from a lot of those different AI kind of native startups. And there's like incredible, great information to see how people are approaching it. I also am really interested on the science side. Like there's a bunch of things that I newsletters that I follow of all the new things that are coming up daily. That's a great way to sort of aggregate that information. On the business strategy side, I love listening to Ben Thompson. I've listened to him for years. So that's sort of interesting on the business side. On the AI and technical side, there's lots of uh, I love hearing data scientists and other ML practitioners and how they're approaching different experiences. And so, like, I really draw a lot of inspiration from all of that. And then on top of it, as designers, I think it's really great to get inspiration from nature and from art
Thank you.
and you know, museums and art history and how different painters have approached light and color and texture. And I'm excited for I think things are going to swing back a little bit. Like there's so much today where those a lot of those AI experiences they're easy to build using things like Shad CN and all of that, but a lot of things are starting to look the same. And I don't know, it's fun to think about maybe this future where we're going to have these really unique or bespoke or personalized experiences. And so, you know, just being inspired by great art is really cool too.
Wow, that's quite a bit. I'm going to ask Valerio, who's on my team, to remind Dave to give us some of this information so we're able to put it in the AI plus UX LinkedIn group. Well, Dave, we're about out of time, and we have some more questions. I'm going to ask Valerio also to put these questions into the AI plus UX LinkedIn group. But what kind of parting advice can you give us for this Friday? What would you suggest to people who are in traditional website design to prepare themselves to apply for perhaps an open position on your team?
Well, we do have open roles. I'd encourage people to take a look. You know, you can look at Amazon Jobs and search for within AWS AI UX or AI ML. We got some open roles, so that's great. Um, I guess my parting words would be just one of optimism. I think there's a lot of um, I see some designers like living in this world right now where there's a lot of change, and like with a lot of change comes discomfort and fear. Um, but I'm an optimist for the future, and I think of like, yes, our roles are going to change. This has happened before. It'll happen again. Our roles are going to change. Think about not what you're losing, but what you're going to be able to create and do in the future that today you're prohibited from doing, right? And the more you can sort of run towards something and move towards something as opposed to wanting to protect the past, it's just a lot more fun, and it's a lot more inspiring world and place to be, I find.
Outstanding advice. Dave Brown, thanks for joining us this Friday. We're going to post this video in the AI plus UX group, but I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk with us today. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.